Proof of work, proof of stake, proof of burn. Today we're going to be discussing the differences between proof of work and proof of stake, especially with the Ethereum 2.0 merge coming in mid-September. We're going to talk about the definitions of both consensus mechanisms, and then we're going to dive into a little bit about the pros and cons to hopefully give you better context into what proof of work is, what proof of stake is, and the benefits and disadvantages of both consensus mechanisms. If this sounds like something you're interested in, let's dive into the difference between the two. Big takeaway here is that proof of work is a decentralized consensus mechanism that requires members of a network to expend effort solving an arbitrary mathematical puzzle to prevent anybody from gaming the system. Now, what that means is when a blockchain miner or a Bitcoin miner enters the network, 50% of their computing power is going to solve all the transactions that are getting added to the block and validating those transactions. 50% of their other computing power is going to solving that cryptographic hash. Due to proof of work, Bitcoin and other cryptocurrency transactions can be processed peer-to-peer in a secure manner without a need for any centralized third party. The problem with proof of work is it requires an enormous amount of energy, especially as the hash rate or the competition between the miners goes up in the network. Proof of stake was one of the several novel consensus mechanisms as an alternative to proof of work, which we'll dive into later here in the video. First, really to understand what proof of work is, you need to understand what hashing algorithms are. So what a hash is, a SHA-256 hash, is you put a given set of data through a hash function, which in Bitcoin's case is that SHA-256 hash algorithm, and it will only ever generate one hash or one correct hash. Due to the avalanche effect, if you change anything on that block, whether it be the balances or whether it be in Bitcoin's case, the transactions, because it's a transaction-based ledger, that will result in a totally unrecognizable hash. And I'll show you a visual example here. So if you were to, in this case for block number 4, which has a nonce of 116,068, that's what made this block green or valid. All the transactions that occurred within the last 7 minutes for the case of Bitcoin are shown here. So you had a certain amount of money from one person, which is a public address, to another person, which is another public address. You had the previous hash, so which block is this block building on? And then everybody on the network can verify it's the correct hash based on the number of leading zeros. Bitcoin started with something small like 4, but now there's up to 18 leading zeros because that's how they adjust the difficulty of hashing these blocks. But as you can see in this video, as you go to change any part of the transaction, the rest of the blocks are now red because what you see here with this hashing algorithm, the hash output is now something that doesn't have any leading zeros at all. So this is a very quick way for the Bitcoin network to verify if the block is in fact correct and if the cryptographic hash, which is the nonce, is correct with all the information that's included in that block. Now, some people say, oh, well, what happens if the hash algorithm is hacked? Well, a private key on the Bitcoin network can theoretically be hacked, but that number is 1 to 2 to the 256. So what that means is that is 115 quadrivigitillion. So basically 1 followed by 75 zeros, which really right now is mathematically infeasible. It'd probably take centuries, if not millennia, just to hack the SHA-256 algorithm. So proof of work, even in the case for Ethereum, is very similar in the sense to how they use that as a consensus mechanism for Bitcoin. So Ethereum, like Bitcoin, currently uses a consensus protocol called proof of work. This allows the nodes of the Ethereum network to all agree in the state of all information that's recorded on the Ethereum blockchain, and it prevents certain kinds of economic attacks, like the 51% attack. Over the next year, proof of work will be phased out in favor of the proof of stake system, which is coming with the ETH 2.0 merge anywhere between 15 to 19 September. Proof of work is a mechanism that allows decentralized Ethereum network to come to a consensus or agree on things like the account balances and the order of the transactions. By doing this, it prevents users from quote unquote double spending. Now, what double spending means is in the event you have 10 Ethereum and you try to send it to A while simultaneously sending it to B, the network does not record that as a double booking, and 10 Ethereum are essentially created out of thin air. So by using this proof of work consensus, they're able to ensure that there's a proper order of transactions to prevent that double spending. So in the case of Ethereum, they have what's called ETH hash, which is the proof of work protocol. This requires miners to go through an intense race of trial and error to find the nonce for the block. So essentially what it's doing is a block has a set of information, and like the visual demonstration, it's currently red. And what miners are doing is they're trying random strings of characters or nonces to make that block valid. And the way that they know it's valid is by looking at that output hash, and it has the correct number of leading zeros. So they're constantly using their mining effort or their hash rate to try to calculate and see what is that nonce for that given period of time. So miners are incentivized to do the work on the Ethereum chain. They verify the transactions, and through this consensus mechanism of proof of work, they're solving that cryptographic hash in order to get the mining reward. There's little incentive for a subset of miners to start their own chain because it actually undermines the system, and since the voting mechanism is based on the number of hashes, it doesn't incentivize miners to try to hack the system because they would have to control 51% of all the hash rate that's being applied to the network. So a major criticism of the proof of work right now is the amount of energy output required to keep the network safe. Right now on the Ethereum proof of work, it consumes 73.2 terawatts annually, which is basically the size of a medium-sized country. So for the pros and cons of proof of work is neutral. You don't need ETH to get started, and block rewards allow you to go from zero to a positive balance. With proof of stake, you actually need the coins or the Ethereum to actually start and stake to be a part of the system. A pro of proof of work is it is tried and tested. It's a consensus mechanism that we've seen work well with Bitcoin and Ethereum throughout the years, and it's kept them secure and decentralized. Compared to the proof of stake alternative consensus mechanism, it's relatively easy to implement a proof of work model as long as you have miners to participate in the network. The cons, though, the proof of work uses so much energy and it's very bad for the environment. If you want to mine, you need to buy specialized equipment, and as other people buy specialized equipment, it makes the mining rewards more difficult to obtain. Therefore, there's this arms race with miners trying to get the best and latest GPUs and equipment to have higher hash rates. And then due to the increased computing need, mining pools could potentially dominate the mining game, which leads to more centralization, which is kind of against the ethos of cryptocurrencies in general. So now that you have a baseline understanding of what proof of work is, let's talk about proof of stake. Vitalik.ca is a great website to get any Ethereum information, and he also has a lot of really good white papers that explain a lot of things within the cryptocurrency realm. So proof of stake is a category of consensus algorithms for public blockchains that depend on validators' economic stake within the network itself. So in a proof of work based public chain, right, like Bitcoin and Ethereum currently are, the algorithm rewards participants who solve cryptographic puzzles in order to validate transactions and create new mining blocks. In a proof of stake based public blockchain, a set of validators take turns proposing and voting on the next block, and the weight of each validator's vote is directly proportional to the size of its stake. So in a proof of work model, one hash, one vote. What that means is the more hashes you have, or the more capital you expend on energy hashing that cryptographic hash algorithm, the more votes you have on which transactions are valid and invalid. For the proof of stake model, you're physically staking that Ethereum, and that staked Ethereum is what's utilized as that consensus mechanism in order to say either transactions or account balances are valid or invalid. Advantages of proof of stake include security, reduced risks of centralization, and energy efficiency, which we'll go into a little bit deeper later. Now, I'll leave this link in the comments below. There's a lot of really good nuggets that Vitalik Buterin has here. Just keep in mind this is very technical, and he dives into different types of algorithms that can be implemented for proof of stake. So what is proof of stake? Well, proof of stake is a cryptocurrency consensus mechanism for processing transaction and creating new blocks on that blockchain. A consensus mechanism, and what that means is it's a method for validating entries into a distributed database and keeping the database secure. So in the case of cryptocurrency, the database is what's called the blockchain, and that's where either the transactions, in the case of Bitcoin, or the account balances, in the case of Ethereum, are stored. Consensus mechanism is essentially how all the participants or validators on the network are able to vote on what are valid and what are invalid transactions. So with the proof of stake, cryptocurrency owners validate block transactions based on the number of coins validators have in a stake. So with the proof of work model, the more hash you add to the network, the more votes you had. So the more energy you expend or the better miners you have, the more weight you have on your votes, whereas in the proof of stake model, it's proportional to the number of coins that you have staked on the network. The proof of work mechanisms require miners to solve cryptographic puzzles, while the proof of stake mechanisms require validators to simply hold and stake the tokens. So on that proof of stake model, there's no cryptographic puzzle to solve because there's no hashing necessary in order to solve the cryptographic hash. Proof of stake is seen as less risky in terms of the potential attack of the network because you would have to own 51% of all of the staked Ethereum, which at this point is around $15 billion just in purchased ETH alone. And obviously, as people start buying Ethereum and rapidly staking it on one wallet, the group or the network of Ethereum can vote on a consensus to avoid a 51% attack. So the key difference between the proof of work versus the proof of stake is instead of competing for the next block by solving the cryptographic hash and the nonce to have the leading number of zeros in that hash rate, the next block writer in a proof of stake system on the blockchain is completely selected at random, with higher odds being assigned to the nodes with larger stake positions. Now, the rest of the network or the validators are still voting on which are valid or invalid account balances for Ethereum, and if you're found to be either dishonest or malicious, you lose all of your staked Ethereum. So another way to think about it is, in the case of proof of work, you're expending energy or effort in the form of hash rate, and that costs energy. So it's more economically feasible to be an honest participant in Bitcoin than it is to try to hack the network. And that's why it's secure in that way. For a proof of stake model, you're actually physically staking those Ethereum tokens. And if you're found to be a dishonest participant, you burn or lose all of that deposited Ethereum. So that incentivizes miners or people to be honest validators and participants of the system. So like we just discussed, validators are selected randomly to mine or validate a block. This system randomizes who gets to mine the next block rather than a competition-based mechanism like proof of work. To become a validator, a coin owner must stake a specific amount of coins, which right now is 32 Ethereum, or roughly about $50,000. Blocks are validated by more than one validator, and when a specific number of the validators verify that the block is accurate through their voting mechanism, it is then finalized and closed, and that block is added to the blockchain. So a side-by-side comparison of these consensus mechanisms is shown here. For the proof of stake, block creators are called validators, where in the case of proof of work, they're called miners. For proof of stake, participants must buy tokens or coins to become a validator, where in proof of work, the participants must buy equipment or GPUs and energy to become a miner. For proof of stake, it's very energy efficient. In the case of proof of work, it's not very energy efficient. Proof of stake allows for more scalability, whereas for proof of work, it does not allow for more scalability. Proof of stake network control can be bought, and for proof of work, robust security due to expensive upfront requirement, which is the equipment necessary and the energy required to be a miner in the network. For proof of stake, validators receive transaction fees as rewards, whereas for proof of work, miners receive block rewards. Ethereum.org does a great job explaining what proof of stake is. Proof of stake, like we've discussed, is a consensus mechanism that Ethereum will use after the merge. The merge being the merge between Ethereum mainnet and Beacon Chain, which is scheduled to happen sometime mid-September. Ethereum is moving off of a proof of work to a proof of stake because it is more secure, it's less energy intensive, and better for implementing new scaling solutions, which we'll discuss later. While it has always been the plan to go to proof of stake, it's far more complex, and there's been a lot of testing that has been done in order to get to this point. So what is proof of stake? Well, proof of stake is a consensus mechanism used by blockchains to achieve a distributed consensus across the network. In proof of work, miners prove they have capital at risk by expending energy. So that's what they're risking to be a part of this network. In proof of stake, validators explicitly stake the capital in the form of Ether into a smart contract on the Ethereum network. This staked Ether then acts as collateral that can be destroyed if the validator behaves dishonestly or lazily. The validator is then responsible for checking that new blocks propagated over the network are valid and occasionally creating and propagating new blocks themselves. So that's what you do when you become a node or a validator on the Ethereum network. Proof of stake is better energy efficiency, lower barriers to entry because you don't have to purchase mining equipment, you just have to purchase the coins. It's reduced centralization risk because what we're seeing with proof of work models is that miners are coming together in pools, and those pools dominate the majority of the rewards going out in the Bitcoin network. And because of the low energy requirement, less Ethereum issuance is required to incentivize participation. So this is how Ethereum is actually going not only from a slight inflationary model, but to a deflationary model. And that was through EIP 1559, which burns a set amount of Ethereum per block based on all the transactions. There's economic penalties for misbehavior that make a 51% style attack, or taking over majority of this network, exponentially more costly for an attacker compared to a proof of work model. So in theory, it would be more expensive to launch a 51% attack against a proof of stake model than it would to launch it against a proof of work model. The community can resort to a social recovery of an honest chain if a 51% hack were to overcome the crypto economic defenses. In the case of proof of work, if the 51% attack is successful, that blockchain is essentially lost forever. But in the case of proof of stake, they can go back to the last known honest block and then hard fork from there to regain essentially what the ecosystem used to be after the attack. So right now, to participate as a validator for this proof of stake model with the Ethereum network, you must deposit 32 ETH into a deposit contract and then run 3 separate pieces of software: an execution client, a consensus client, and then a validator. Now this is difficult because you need a 24/7 connection to internet, but it's not very hardware intensive in like most Bitcoin miners, which require massive GPUs that are hugely expensive. Stay tuned for a future video on how to stake, and I'll be going through specific examples of how you can stake your Ethereum. But what happens is, once you deposit that Ether, the user joins an activation queue that limits the rate of new validators joining the network. Once activated, validators receive new blocks from peers from the Ethereum network that's selected on a random basis. The transactions delivered in the block are re-executed, and the block signature is checked to ensure that the block is valid. The validator then sends a vote, which is called an attestation, in favor of that block across the entire network. And there's a lot of other really good information that I'll leave in the comments below. The pros are staking makes it easier for individuals to participate in securing the network, which promotes more decentralization. Validator node can be run on a normal laptop rather than needing some massive GPU or high expensive mining rig. Staking pools allow users to stake without having the 32 ETH. So to run your own validator, it requires 32 ETH and all the descriptions that I showed you above. However, you can stake with a lot less Ethereum with staking pools, either on centralized exchanges or different ETH pools, which we'll talk about later in this video. Staking is more decentralized. The economies of scale do not apply in the same way that they do for proof of work mining. What that means is more people can become participants or stakers, whereas for mining, it's starting to become more centralized because there's relatively few dominant miner plays out there that own the majority of the rigs. Proof of stake offers greater crypto economic security than a proof of work, and less issuance of Ether is required in order to incentivize the market participants, which is how Ethereum is going from a slightly inflationary model to actually a deflationary model, where more Ethereum is going to be burned than is going to be generated through the block reward system. A proof of stake is younger and less battle and tested than the proof of work model. Proof of stake is more complex to implement than a proof of work, which is a con, and users need to run 3 separate pieces of software to participate in the proof of stake. However, you can get around this by staking your ETH with either a pool or on a centralized exchange. The merge. So why does this proof of stake matter at all? Well, soon the Ethereum mainnet, which is currently running on a proof of work model, will merge with the Beacon chain, which was launched December of 2020, and that will end proof of work as we know it with the Ethereum network. This sets the stage for future scaling upgrades to include sharding, which we'll touch on briefly at the end of this video, and the merge will reduce Ethereum's energy consumption by 99.95%, because you don't need all of that hashing or competition in the form of energy in order to solve the cryptographic hash. You greatly reduce the amount of energy required to maintain the network. Right now, it's still scheduled sometime Q3, Q4. Latest updates was about mid-September for the launch, and it's the most significant upgrade in the history of Ethereum. Extensive testing and bug bounties were undertaken to ensure that there is a safe transition from a proof of work to a proof of stake model. So right now, we are currently on the Ethereum mainnet, which is using a proof of work model. The Beacon chain, which has been running since December 2020, has been used where you can actually stake Ethereum and earn rewards on it as they test this consensus mechanism, And they've also been merging it with other test nets, or essentially copies of the Ethereum mainnet, in order to battle test it and see if there's any bugs on it. Ethereum energy consumption is one of the main pros of a proof of stake model. Ethereum's energy consumption will be reduced by 99.95% following the merge from going from a proof of work model to a proof of stake model. After the merge, Ethereum will use drastically less carbon to be more secure. Since its inception, Ethereum has aimed to implement a proof of stake consensus mechanism, but doing this without compromising security, scalability, and decentralizations. Therefore, the network has started using a proof of work consensus because that proof of work consensus was battle tested over the years. Proof of work consensus requires miners to use their computing hardware to solve a puzzle. The solution to this puzzle proves that energy has to be expended to the miner, demonstrating that they have invested real-world value for the right to add to the blockchain, right? So they are putting their own money at risk in the form of spending capital on energy in order to be a participant of the system. Both proof of work and proof of stake are just mechanisms to decide who gets the next block. And I want to emphasize this. A proof of work mechanism and a proof of stake mechanism are only mechanisms to decide who gets to add to the next block. So a lot of the fundamental technology that's included in blockchain technology will be on a proof of stake model. The only thing that's changing is that consensus mechanism. Who has the right to add the next block? Swapping a proof of work for a proof of stake, where the real world value comes from the ETH that's staked directly into a smart contract, which removes the need for miners to burn energy and add to the blockchain. Therefore, the environmental cost of securing the network is drastically reduced. So in this article, it talks a little bit about the beacon chain. It also talks about why proof of stake is greener than proof of work. And there's a really helpful graph here to kind of show you what the energy expenditure of current proof of work models are. Ironically, YouTube is at 244 terawatts per year currently. Gold mining is at 240 terawatts per year. Bitcoin proof of work is at 200. ETH proof of work is at 112. Netflix at 94. And as you can see here, an Ethereum proof of stake system, 0.01 terawatts per year. So that's a 1,000-fold reduction in energy consumption. So in closing, proof of work and proof of stake are merely consensus mechanisms. A lot of the blockchain technology will still be the same for the Ethereum network. The only thing that will change is who has the right to add the next block and how do we incentivize the validators and the nodes in that network. For proof of work, capital in the form of energy is expended as work on the system, whereas for proof of stake, the amount of capital that you expend is directly proportional to the amount of Ethereum that you stake in the network. For proof of work miners, the more energy you expend, the more hashes you have, the more likely you are to solve that cryptographic hash and receive the reward. In the case of Ethereum, the more Ethereum that you physically stake, the more likely you are to be the one that adds the next block to the network in order to receive the block reward. So it's just a different way to incentivize the validators of the network and a different way to maintain security and prevent malicious attacks or dishonest participants. Both proof of work and proof of stake have their pros and cons, and I hope this video gave you better context into the pros and cons of both so that you can have a deeper understanding of blockchain. And if you like this video, stick around because I'll be producing more content like this in the future. Smash that like button, comment below, and subscribe to see more videos like this in the future. Thanks, and I'll see you around.